I paid $25,000 to host my family at my graduation, but they used it for a beach vacation instead. The notification sound from my phone cut through the morning silence like a knife. I was already dressed in my cap and gown, standing in my tiny studio apartment that smelled like instant coffee and determination. My hands shook as I opened Instagram, expecting to see congratulations messages from friends. Instead, I saw my entire family lounging under palm trees in Miami. My mother had tagged the location, South Beach, Miami. The caption made my stomach drop. Finally, a real vacation with the whole fam. Sometimes you just need to escape and live a little. Palm tree sun, #blessed, #family time, #Miami life. There was my dad, grinning in a Hawaiian shirt I'd never seen before. My brother Jake sprawled across a beach chair, drink in hand, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. And my mom, my mom, was wearing a designer sundress that probably cost more than my textbooks last semester. The money I'd sent them. My money. $25,000 that I'd scraped together working 3 jobs, eating nothing but peanut butter sandwiches and ramen noodles for 4 years. Money I'd trusted them with to organize the graduation celebration I'd dreamed about since freshman year. I sank onto my secondhand couch, still staring at the photos. There were 12 of them. Poolside selfies, restaurant shots, beach walks at sunset. Posted over the last 3 days. 3 days during which my calls had gone straight to voicemail and my texts had been left on read. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, about to graduate summa cum laude from Northwestern with a double major in finance and economics, and I'd just been played by my own family like some naive kid. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. For years ago, I'd made a promise to myself. I was going to college, and I was going to do it without asking my parents for a dime. Not because they couldn't afford it. Dad managed a mid-sized construction company, and Mom worked as a real estate agent, but because I'd grown tired of the strings that came attached to their help. The guilt trips. The reminders. The way they'd hold it over my head whenever I made a decision they didn't like. So I worked. I waited tables at Marco's Italian joint 4 nights a week, pulling doubles on weekends. I stocked shelves at Target from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. before classes. During summers, I picked up a 3rd job doing data entry for a local insurance company. My classmates were joining sororities and going to Cabo for spring break. I was calculating how many shifts I needed to cover next semester's tuition. I lived off campus in a studio that was basically a closet with a hot plate. The refrigerator was the size of a dorm mini-fridge, and the shower had exactly 2 settings, freezing cold and scalding hot. But it was mine. I paid for every square foot of it. The savings started sophomore year, when I realized I wanted something more than just survival. I wanted a celebration. I wanted my family there when I walked across that stage. Not just there, I wanted them to be proud, to see what I'd accomplished, to celebrate with me the way families do in movies. So I started putting away every extra dollar I could find. Tips that were higher than expected. The occasional overtime shift. Even returnable bottles and cans I'd collect from around campus. It all went into a savings account I called the Dream Fund. By senior year, I had $25,847.63. I'd counted it obsessively. Every penny represented hours of work, sacrifice, saying no to things I wanted. That money was my security blanket, and my celebration fund rolled into one. 3 months before graduation, I made the call. I told my parents I wanted to do something special. Fly them up to Chicago, put them in a nice hotel, take everyone out for proper dinner. Make it a weekend they'd never forget. Sweetheart, that's so generous. Mom had gushed over the phone. But honey, that sounds expensive. Are you sure you can afford it? I'd laughed. Mom, I've been saving for this for 3 years. I want to celebrate with the people who matter most to me. Dad had gotten on the line, his voice warm with what I thought was pride. You don't have to do that, kiddo. We're proud of you no matter what. I want to, I'd insisted. Let me handle everything. Flights, hotel, dinner reservations. I've got it all figured out. That's when Mom suggested I just send them the money instead. You know how I am with planning, honey. And with your dad's schedule and Jake's work, it might be easier if we handle the logistics from this end. You just focus on your studies. It made sense. They knew the family better than I did, who could get time off, who needed special accommodations. I transferred $25,000 to my mother's account that same week, keeping just enough for my cap and gown rental and a nice outfit for the celebration dinner. The weeks that followed were electric with anticipation. I'd never been more excited about anything in my life. Not the graduation itself, though that mattered, but the idea of my family being there. My parents seeing me succeed. Jake finally realizing his little sister had made something of herself. I should have known something was wrong when they stopped answering my calls about the details. "Don't worry about it, honey," Mom would say when I'd catch her. "Everything's handled." When I asked about their flights, Dad said, "All booked, kiddo. Just focus on your finals." Jake didn't answer his phone at all, but that wasn't unusual. He'd been distant since dropping out of his community college program 6 months ago. The morning of graduation, I woke up with butterflies in my stomach. I'd pictured this day 1,000 times. I'd even practiced my walk across the stage in my tiny apartment, imagining the sound of my family cheering from the audience. I reached for my phone to call them, to coordinate where we'd meet before the ceremony. That's when I saw the Instagram notification. Sitting there in my cap and gown, looking at photos of my family living it up in Miami on my money, I felt something break inside me. Not just disappointment, though that was there too. It was the realization that I'd been played by the people who were supposed to love me most. I called my mom. It went straight to voicemail. I called my dad. Same thing. I texted the family group chat. "Hope you're enjoying Miami. Would have been nice to know." The read receipts showed they'd all seen it. No one responded. 2 hours later, I walked across that stage alone. I heard my name called out over the loudspeaker, shook the dean's hand, and smiled for the photographer. In the audience, families cheered and cameras flashed. I looked out into the crowd, scanning for faces I knew wouldn't be there, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. That night, I sat in my empty apartment with my diploma propped against a stack of textbooks, eating leftover pizza and wondering how I'd been so stupid. How I'd let myself believe that this time would be different. That this time, they'd actually show up for me. But as the tears dried and the anger set in, I remembered something that made me sit up straighter. Something they'd all forgotten about. Something that was about to change everything. I gave them 48 hours. 2 full days to reach out with an explanation and apology, something that might make sense of what they'd done. I kept my phone close, checking it obsessively, waiting for the call that would somehow make this right. It never came. On Tuesday morning, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I called my mom's number, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and desperate hope. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice bright and cheerful like nothing had happened. "Oh, hi honey. How was graduation? We've been meaning to call." Meaning to call? The words came out sharper than I intended. "Mom, where were you?" A pause. I could hear beach sounds in the background. Waves, seagulls, people laughing. They were still there. Still on vacation with my money. "Well, she started, then stopped." I heard her move somewhere quieter. "Listen, sweetie, we can explain. You know how crazy things have been lately, and when this opportunity came up for a family trip." What opportunity? I was standing now, pacing my tiny apartment. "I gave you $25,000 to come to my graduation. We thought you'd understand," she said, and I could hear the defensive edge creeping into her voice. "You're always saying how independent you are, how you don't need anyone. We figured you'd be fine." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. "I saved for 3 years for this, Mom. 3 years. And look what an amazing graduation gift you gave yourself." Her tone was so aggressively positive it made my teeth ache. "A beautiful family vacation. We're making memories, honey. Isn't that what matters?" I hung up. 30 minutes later, I tried my dad. He answered reluctantly, like he'd been expecting my call. "Hey, kiddo." His voice was tired, guilty. "Dad, what the hell happened?" He sighed heavily. "Look, your mother, she's been really stressed lately. The real estate market's been tough, and she felt like we all needed a break. When she saw those Miami deals online, with my graduation money. "We'll pay you back," he said quickly. "Once we get home and sort things out. You know we're good for it." That's not the point. I was crying now, angry tears that I couldn't stop. I wanted you there. I worked 3 jobs to save that money so we could celebrate together. "I know, kiddo. I know. But you've got to understand." I hung up on him too. Jake didn't answer when I called. He never answered anymore. That afternoon, I drove back to campus one last time to return my cap and gown. The rental office was nearly empty, just a few other graduates doing the same thing. As I walked across the quad where the ceremony had been held, I could see families still taking pictures, still celebrating. I sat down on the same bleachers where I'd sat alone 2 days ago, watching other people's joy, and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the money, though that stung, but the casual dismissal of something that mattered so much to me. I thought about all the times I'd covered for them. The Christmas, when Jake had been arrested for drunk driving and I'd paid his bail without telling our parents. The time Mom's real estate deal fell through and I'd quietly transferred money to cover their mortgage payment. The way they'd take my help but never quite acknowledge it like it was just expected. "You're so independent," Mom had said. Like it was a character flaw instead of something I'd been forced to become. That night, I cried until I was empty. I cried for the little girl who'd believed that working hard enough would make her family proud. I cried for the graduate who'd pictured her parents cheering in the audience. I cried for every dollar I'd saved, every shift I'd worked, every sacrifice I'd made for people who saw it as an opportunity rather than a gift. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the tears finally stopped, something else took their place. A cold, clear anger that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. I sat up in bed and realized I wasn't as powerless as they thought. I wasn't as powerless as I'd thought. Because there was something they didn't know. Something none of them knew. Aunt Lorraine had died 11 months ago, and she'd left me everything. Not just a little something. Everything. Her house in Lincoln Park worth $800,000. Her investment portfolio worth nearly $2 million. Her vintage jewelry collection. Her cabin up in Wisconsin. All of it. Lorraine had never married, never had kids. She'd always said I reminded her of herself. Too smart for my own good and too stubborn to settle for less than I deserved. When she'd gotten sick, I was the only one who'd visited regularly. The only one who'd sat with her during chemo treatments. The only one who'd cared enough to show up. My parents had always dismissed Lorraine as the eccentric sister who lived alone with too many cats. They'd made jokes about her at family dinners, rolled their eyes at her pointed comments about their spending habits and priorities. They had no idea what she'd left behind, or who she'd left it to. The lawyer had been very clear. I was the sole beneficiary and executor. Everything was mine to do with as I saw fit. For 11 months, I'd left it all untouched, too overwhelmed by grief and responsibility to make any changes. I'd been content to let things sit, to finish school, to figure out my life. But now, sitting in my apartment at 3 in the morning, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in days. They'd forgotten that I wasn't just independent by choice anymore. I was independent by inheritance. And I was about to remind them exactly what that meant. Aunt Lorraine had always been the family outlier. Where my mother was all smiles and social climbing, Lorraine was sharp-tongued and fiercely independent. Where the rest of the family measured success in square footage and social media likes, Lorraine measured it in books read and principles kept. She lived in a 3-story brownstone in Lincoln Park that she'd bought in 1987 for what seemed like nothing and turned into something extraordinary. Every room was filled with carefully curated antiques, first edition novels, and art she'd collected during her travels. She'd never married, never found a man who could keep up, she'd tell me with a wink, and never had children, though she'd been a professor of literature at DePaul for 37 years. My mother used to complain that Lorraine was difficult. What she really meant was that Lorraine called out their bullshit and refused to pretend otherwise. I remembered Christmas dinners where Lorraine would sit at the end of the table, watching my parents with those sharp green eyes that seemed to see everything. When Dad would brag about his latest business deal, or Mom would show off some expensive purchase, Lorraine would just raise an eyebrow and change the subject to something that actually mattered. "Tell me about school, Elena," she'd say, ignoring whatever my parents were discussing. "What are you reading? What are you thinking about?" She was the only one who asked what I was thinking about. When I'd started college, she'd been the one to drive me to campus. Not my parents. They'd been too busy with some real estate conference Mom couldn't miss. Lorraine had helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my dorm, looked around the tiny room I'd be sharing with a stranger, and nodded approvingly. "Small spaces build character," she'd said. "I lived in a studio apartment in Paris for 2 years when I was your age. Best education I ever got." She'd slipped me $200 before leaving. "For books," she'd said firmly when I tried to refuse. "Real books, not just textbooks. Feed your mind, not just your grade point average." Every few months during college, she'd call to check in. Never about grades or career plans. Those conversations bore her. She wanted to know what I was discovering, what I was questioning, whether I was becoming the person I wanted to be, or just the person everyone else expected me to be. "Your mother tells me you're working 3 jobs," she'd said during one of our calls sophomore year. "That's admirable, but don't let it consume you. The goal isn't just to survive, Elena. It's to thrive." When she'd gotten sick last spring, I was the only family member who'd shown up consistently. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed too late for any real hope. The rest of the family had made the appropriate concern noises, sent flowers, promised to visit soon. But when soon never came, it was just me and Lorraine in those sterile hospital rooms and later in her beautiful house, where she'd insisted on spending her final weeks. I'd driven down from Chicago every weekend, sometimes more often when she was having bad days. We'd sit in her library, surrounded by thousands of books, and she'd tell me stories about her travels, her students, the life she'd built on her own terms. "I never regretted not having children," she told me one afternoon while I helped her organize her jewelry collection. "But if I had, I would have wanted one like you. Someone who understands that the most important thing you can own is your own integrity." She died on a Tuesday night in September, peacefully in her sleep, just like the doctors had hoped. I'd found her the next morning when she didn't answer my usual check-in call. The funeral was small, embarrassingly small. I'd arranged everything: the service, the flowers, the obituary that ran in both the Tribune and the Sun-Times. I'd expected my parents would at least show up for appearances. Mom had claimed she was showing a house she couldn't reschedule. Dad had mumbled something about a work emergency. Jake hadn't even responded to the text. So it was me, a handful of her former colleagues, some neighbors, and the pastor from the church she'd attended sporadically. 7 people total saying goodbye to a woman who'd lived 73 years and touched hundreds of lives through her teaching. I'd sat in the front pew alone, listening to Professor Martinez talk about Lorraine's passion for Victorian literature and her legendary tough love approach to lazy students, and felt a familiar mix of grief and rage at my family's absence. 2 weeks later, I'd met with Robert Henley, Lorraine's lawyer for the past 15 years. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd clearly respected my aunt enormously. "Elena," he'd said, settling behind his desk with a manila folder thick with documents, "Lorraine spoke about you often. She was very clear about her intentions." What followed was the most surreal hour of my life. Property deeds, investment portfolios, insurance policies, bank accounts. The brownstone was worth $800,000. Her stock portfolio, carefully managed over 4 decades, was worth nearly $2 million. There were savings accounts, CDs, a vintage jewelry collection appraised at over $300,000, and a cabin in Wisconsin I'd never even known existed. She was quite specific that you were to be the sole beneficiary and executor, Mr. Henley had explained. She trusted your judgment completely. The total estate value was just over $3.5 million. I'd sat there in shock, trying to process numbers that seemed impossible. Lorraine had lived modestly, never flaunted her wealth, never acted like someone who could have afforded anything she wanted. "She wanted you to have complete control," Mr. Henley had continued. No restrictions, no requirements. She said you'd earned the right to decide what mattered. For 11 months, I'd done nothing with any of it. The responsibility felt too enormous, too loaded with grief and obligation. I'd left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, visiting the house occasionally to check on things, but otherwise pretending the inheritance didn't exist. But now, sitting in my tiny apartment at 3 in the morning, thinking about my family spending my graduation money on margaritas in Miami, I finally understood what Lorraine had been trying to give me. Not just money.
Power.
The power to choose who deserved my loyalty. The power to decide what family really meant. The power to build something that couldn't be taken away. The next morning, I called in sick to my part-time job at the campus bookstore and spent the day going through every financial record I could find. Bank statements, canceled checks, Venmo transactions, Cash App transfers. I wanted to see exactly how much of my own money I'd given my family over the years. The number was staggering: $47,000. $47,000 that I'd quietly funneled to them over 4 years of college. Money from my jobs, sure, but also money I'd started accessing from Lorraine's estate without really thinking about it as inheritance. She'd set up a trust account that gave me limited access for educational and emergency expenses, and I'd been far too generous with my definition of emergency. There was the $8,000 I'd sent when my parents' mortgage was 3 months behind. Mom had called me crying, saying they might lose the house, that Dad's business was going through a rough patch. I'd transferred the money that same day, telling them it was from a scholarship refund. The $12,000 for Jake's community college tuition when he decided to give school another shot. He'd lasted exactly 1 semester before dropping out to pursue what he called his entrepreneurial phase, which mostly involved selling questionable supplements on Instagram. The $6,500 for Dad's dental implants when their insurance wouldn't cover the full procedure. It's affecting my confidence at work, he'd explained. Hard to close deals when you're embarrassed to smile. The $3,200 I'd wired them for a family emergency that turned out to be Mom's desire to redo their kitchen backsplash before hosting her book club. Smaller amounts too, $500 here, $800 there. Car repairs, medical bills, Christmas presents for relatives, a dozen other crises that somehow always required my immediate financial intervention. The pattern was always the same: a panicked phone call about some urgent need, a promise that they'd pay me back as soon as things stabilized, my immediate transfer of money, followed by profound gratitude that lasted exactly until the next crisis. I'd never asked for repayment because I told myself it was what families did for each other. But looking at the numbers now, I realized something that made my chest tight with anger. They'd never even offered. Not once had they said, "We know you're in school. We'll pay you back when we can." It was always just grateful acceptance, like I was some kind of ATM programmed to dispense cash whenever they had a problem. But here's what they didn't know. Some of that help hadn't come from my waitressing tips and Target paychecks. When Lorraine's estate had been settled, Mr. Henley had explained that she'd set up something called a discretionary trust that I could access for reasonable expenses while finishing school. The idea was that I wouldn't have to worry about money while grieving and completing my degree. What qualified as reasonable was largely up to my judgment. Textbooks and rent, obviously, but also helping family members in genuine need. Lorraine had always believed in taking care of people who mattered to you. The problem was, I'd been defining genuine need very generously. That mortgage payment? I'd pulled it from Lorraine's trust, telling myself it was protecting my family's stability. Jake's tuition? Same account. Dad's dental work? Lorraine's money. They'd been living off my deceased aunt's generosity for months without even knowing it. But the most shocking discovery came when I dug deeper into Lorraine's property records. The house my parents lived in, the house I'd helped save from foreclosure, wasn't actually theirs. It belonged to Lorraine. She'd bought it 15 years ago when my parents were facing bankruptcy from Dad's failed construction business. Instead of lending them money, she'd quietly purchased their house and let them continue living there, paying what they thought was a mortgage but was actually rent. The deed had never been transferred. Legally, they were tenants.
And now?
Now I was their landlord. I spent the rest of the day making phone calls. The first was to Mr. Henley. "Robert, I need to understand exactly what properties Aunt Lorraine owned when she died." He was surprised to hear from me, but happy to help. As he pulled up the files, the scope of what I'd inherited became even clearer. Not just the Lincoln Park brownstone and the Wisconsin cabin. 3 rental properties in the suburbs. A small office building downtown. And yes, the house in Elmhurst where my parents lived. She never told them she owned it, he confirmed. She felt they needed to maintain their dignity. "But Elena, as the new owner, you have full discretion over the arrangement." My second call was to Citizens Bank, where my parents had their checking and savings accounts. Accounts that, it turned out, listed my mother as having emergency access to one of Lorraine's pension accounts, something Lorraine had set up years ago in case she needed help managing her finances as she aged. Mom had never used it, probably never even remembered it existed. But the access was still there. I removed her name that afternoon. The third call was to the property management company that handled Lorraine's rentals. My parents' mortgage payments were automatically deducted from their account each month and deposited into an escrow account that paid property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. I instructed the company to redirect those payments to a new account, one that I controlled. By evening, I'd systematically closed every financial pipeline that had been quietly supporting my family for years. The emergency access accounts, the trust fund distributions, the below-market rent arrangement, all of it. They had no idea what was coming. That night, I sat in Lorraine's brownstone for the first time since her death. I'd inherited it fully furnished, and walking through those rooms filled with her books and art and carefully chosen treasures, I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach me. Family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. And my blood family had just shown me exactly where I ranked in their priorities. As I sat in her library, surrounded by the life she'd built on her own terms, I made a decision that would have made her proud. I was done being their ATM. I was done being their safety net. I was done pretending that love was supposed to be a one-way transaction. In 6 weeks, we'd all be gathering for Thanksgiving, and I was going to give them something to be truly grateful for. The truth. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were delicious torture. I watched my parents scramble as their financial safety nets quietly disappeared, one by one. Dad called first, his voice confused and slightly panicked. "Kiddo, there's some mix-up with the mortgage company. They're saying our automatic payment got redirected somewhere. You don't know anything about that, do you?" I'd been practicing my innocent voice. "That's weird, Dad. Have you called them?" 3 times. "They keep saying the account owner made changes, but we own the house. It doesn't make sense." I said, letting the silence stretch. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." Mom called 2 days later about the pension account access issue. "Elena, honey, the strangest thing happened. Your Aunt Lorraine had given me emergency access to one of her accounts years ago, just in case she needed help. But now they're saying I'm not authorized anymore. Did you change something?" "Why would I change anything, Mom? I barely understand how any of that financial stuff works." The lies came so easily. For years, they'd lied to me about loving me, about being proud, about priorities and family loyalty. Now it was my turn. Jake tried a different approach. He actually showed up at my apartment one evening, looking nervous and fidgety.
"Hey, sis. Been a while."
I let him stand in my doorway, not inviting him in. "It has. Look, I know things got weird after graduation, with the Miami thing and all." He stuffed his hands in his pockets. "But family's family, right? Is it?" He shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, I'm in a bit of a bind. My rent's due and my roommate bailed, and I was wondering if you might be able to help me out. Just this once. I'm good for it." I almost laughed. Just this once. Like I hadn't been helping him just this once for 4 years. "Sorry, Jake. I'm pretty broke myself after graduation expenses." He left looking confused and slightly angry, like I'd broken some unspoken rule. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I was practically vibrating with anticipation. I'd spent weeks imagining this moment, planning exactly what I'd say and how I'd say it. Mom had insisted on hosting at their house, the house they didn't know they'd own, and I'd agreed with an enthusiasm that should have been suspicious. I arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of expensive wine I'd bought with money from Lorraine's account. The irony felt perfect. Mom answered the door with the biggest, fakest smile I'd ever seen. She pulled me into a hug that lasted about 10 seconds too long, squeezing me like she was trying to physically force our relationship back to normal. "Elena. Oh, sweetheart. We've missed you so much. Haven't we, Richard?" Dad appeared behind her, grinning widely and calling me kiddo, every other sentence like he was making up for lost time. "How's our college graduate doing, kiddo? Proud of you, kiddo. Come on in, kiddo." It was like watching actors who'd forgotten how to play their characters. Jake mumbled a hello from the couch, where he was watching football with aggressive intensity. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Dinner was a masterclass in forced normalcy. Mom had outdone herself with the cooking, turkey, stuffing, 3 different kinds of potatoes, green bean casserole, homemade cranberry sauce. The kind of meal that said we're a loving family in case anyone was keeping score. They asked about my job search, my apartment, my plans for the holidays. All surface-level questions that carefully avoided any mention of graduation, Miami, or the $25,000 elephant in the room. I answered politely, playing my part in their charade while internally counting down to the moment I'd been rehearsing for weeks. Halfway through the meal, during a lull in their increasingly desperate small talk, I set down my fork and smiled. "I have an announcement to make." The conversation stopped. 3 pairs of eyes focused on me, with varying degrees of wariness. "I've been working with Aunt Lorraine's lawyer to finalize her estate. Just wanted you all to know that everything's been settled." Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Settled how, kiddo?" "You know, distributed. Made official. All the paperwork's been filed with the court." I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. "I thought you should know since some of you had been involved with her financial arrangements over the years." Mom's face had gone pale. "What do you mean, involved?" "Well, Mom, didn't you have access to one of her accounts? And Dad, weren't you wondering about those mortgage payment issues?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear their minds racing, trying to figure out what I knew and how much trouble they might be in. Jake was the first to speak. "What kind of estate are we talking about here? I mean, Aunt Lorraine lived pretty simply, right?" I laughed, a sound that came out sharper than I'd intended. "Oh, Jake. Aunt Lorraine was worth about $3.5 million when she died. And she left every penny of it to me." 3 forks clattered onto plates simultaneously. 3.5. Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "Million," I confirmed. "The house, the investments, the rental properties. All of it. Including this house, actually. Did you know Aunt Lorraine bought this place 15 years ago when you were facing bankruptcy? You've been paying rent to her estate all these years." Dad's face had gone from confused to horrified. "Elena, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that for months, I've been financially supporting this family, without any of you knowing it. I'm saying that when you took my graduation money to go to Miami, you were stealing from someone who'd been keeping you afloat." I stood up, reaching into my purse. "And I'm saying that I've updated everything. The trust accounts, the property arrangements, the emergency access permissions. All of it." I pulled out a set of keys and placed them on the table. They landed with a small metallic clink that sounded like a gavel. "Those are the keys to Aunt Lorraine's lake house in Wisconsin. She always said it should go to family who understood what family really meant." I picked up my purse and coat. "Turns out that's not any of you." "Elena, wait." Mom started to stand. "Don't."
My voice was ice.
"You had your chance to show up for me. You chose a vacation instead. I hope it was worth it." I walked to the door, my heart pounding but my steps steady. The inheritance is going to people who were actually there for me. People who know that love isn't something you only give when it's convenient. I paused at the door, looking back at 3 faces frozen in shock and dawning understanding. "Enjoy your dinner. Oh, and your rent's due on the 1st. I walked out into the cold November air, leaving behind the family that had never really been mine and stepping into the life that finally was. It's been exactly 1 year since I walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner, and I'm sitting in my new apartment, my actual apartment, not a closet with a hot plate, watching the sunrise over Lake Michigan. The view alone is worth more than everything I owned a year ago, but it's not the most valuable thing I've gained. That would be peace. The apartment is in Aunt Lorraine's old building, actually. After months of therapy and soul-searching, I decided to sell the Lincoln Park brownstone. Too many memories, too much house for one person. But I kept this 2-bedroom unit on the 15th floor that she bought as an investment property years ago. It feels right, living in something she chose, something that represents the practical wisdom she tried to teach me. I furnished it slowly, deliberately. Every piece is something I actually love, not just something I could afford. The vintage leather sofa I found at an estate sale. The oak dining table where I host friends for dinner parties. The bookshelf that spans an entire wall, filled with first editions and dog-eared paperbacks and everything in between. The Northwestern University Elena Rodriguez Scholarship Fund was my first major decision as inheritor of Lorraine's legacy. I endowed it with $500,000, enough to provide full tuition for 2 first-generation college students every year in perpetuity. The selection criteria are simple: academic merit, demonstrated financial need, and a personal essay about what family means to them. The first recipients were announced last month. Maria Gonzalez from Pilsen, whose father works 3 jobs to support 4 kids. David Kim from Chinatown, whose immigrant parents sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had. When I met them at the scholarship dinner, I saw myself 3 years ago, hungry, determined, carrying the weight of everyone's dreams on their shoulders. "We won't let you down," Maria had said, shaking my hand with the kind of fierce grip that told me she understood the gift she'd been given. "You already haven't," I'd replied, meaning it completely. Therapy was Dr. Patricia Chen's idea, though she suggested it so gently I thought it was mine. I'd started seeing her 6 months ago when I realized that cutting my family off had solved the immediate problem but left me with a deeper question. How do you build genuine relationships when you've never really had them? Trauma teaches us that love is conditional, she explained during one of our sessions. Your family taught you that their affection depended on your usefulness. Now you get to learn what unconditional care actually looks like. It's harder work than I expected. Learning to trust that friends like Alex and Sarah, college roommates who'd actually called after graduation to check on me, weren't just being nice because they wanted something. Learning to accept help without immediately wondering what I owed in return. Learning that boundaries aren't selfish, they're essential. The hardest part has been the emails. They started about 2 months after Thanksgiving. Innocent subject lines like, "just checking in," and "how are you?" and "thinking of you." I read the first few, morbid curiosity getting the better of me. Mom's emails are masterpieces of manipulation disguised as concern. She talks about how much they miss me, how the house feels empty without my calls, how she can't understand what went wrong between us. She never mentions Miami. She never mentions the money. She just rewrites history until they're the victims of my inexplicable coldness. Dads are shorter, more direct. "Kiddo, let's talk this through. Family's family." As if those magic words could erase years of taking me for granted. Jake's attempts are the most pathetic. He tried friend requests on every social media platform, sent LinkedIn invitations claiming he wanted to network, even showed up at my old apartment building before remembering I'd moved. His emails alternate between angry, "You think you're better than us now," and pleading, "I'm your brother, doesn't that mean anything?" The latest one came yesterday. The subject line read, "We miss you," and the first line was, "Elena, it's been a year. Can't we put this behind us?" I deleted it without reading the rest. Because here's what they still don't understand. This isn't about holding a grudge. This isn't about punishment or revenge or making them suffer. This is about recognizing that some people will only value you when they need something from you, and choosing to build your life around the people who value you just for existing. I have those people now. Alex, who brings me soup when I'm sick and never mentions the expensive bottle of wine I served at her birthday party. Sarah, who listens to me talk through work stress without offering solutions unless I ask for them. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who leaves homemade cookies outside my door and invited me to her grandson's high school graduation because everyone deserves to have people cheering for them. Dr. Chun, who helped me understand that choosing my own family wasn't giving up on the concept of family, it was honoring it. Last week, I got a letter from David Kim, one of the scholarship recipients. He's struggling with organic chemistry but determined to become a doctor. I think about what you said at the dinner, he wrote, about how the best families are the ones that choose each other. I'm choosing to make you proud. That letter is pinned to my refrigerator, next to a photo of Aunt Lorraine and me at last year's book festival. She would have loved David's earnestness, Maria's fierce ambition, the way they're both building something that can't be taken away. My biological family chose a vacation over my biggest moment. I chose to build a legacy. They're still sending emails, still trying to find a way back in. But I already have a family. I built it myself, one genuine relationship at a time. And unlike the one I was born into, this one actually shows up.